You're right, and you know the old school black politician like a Coleman Young or a Tom Bradley in Los Angeles or Harold Washington or Maynard Jackson and Andy Young in Atlanta
Or Harold Ford here in
or Harold
Tennessee.
Ford. What they really understood, because they came out of the civil rights movement, Marion Barry included,
Mm-hmm.
what they really understood was that their ascension to power was really built upon the work of others. And
Exactly.
they felt a deep obligation to their community. And when you look at those first line black mayors who were sort of the pioneers, what they really tried to do was bust up, you know, the old boys network in those cities. So you had someone like Harold Washington come in and just challenge, you know, the Democratic machine in Chicago and overcome it. You had Maynard Jackson, who used the Atlanta airport as a means to build black wealth and to make sure that black companies would have contracts. So you had these people who understood that they were in a unique position to assist their community. What we have now in the sort of this nouveau black politician are people who honestly believe that they were elected because there's something unique about them. And it really is all about them. And
Mm-hmm.
so they find themselves thinking that they have no responsibility and obligation to the African American community. And lo and behold, what begins to happen is these people end up isolating themselves to the point that they are prone to corruption. They are prone to failure because they have now detached themselves and removed themselves completely from their own constituency, which no other ethnic group's politicians ever did,
Mm-hmm.
because they understood that at any given moment your number could be called. And when your number is called, you want to have troops. That's why, even with all of his personal baggage, Marion Barry is still loved in Washington, D.C.,
Exactly.
because people remember Marion as the fighter on the city council, as the fighter in the mayor's office. He changed Washington, D.C. as a city. He took a sleepy government town and really opened it up to the private sector. Washington, D.C. was a different city after Marion Barry served. Atlanta was a different city after Maynard Jackson. You know, Detroit, as you mentioned, Coleman Young, Harold Washington. So what we've lost is sort of the black politician at the mayoral level who sees his role and sees his responsibility as improving the quality of life of not just the city, but his
And I
own.
think the other development to look at the other side of that is we as a people have become anesthetized. We're into love and hip hop. We're into other reality shows. Some of us are rubbing our hands. We can't wait to watch Preachers of LA. All kind of things going on. And I'm not saying that to say that people shouldn't recreate and kick back their shoes, but at the same time, we have to pay attention to what's going on. For example, we were upset about Trayvon Martin, but we have various incidents that have happened recently that are just as bad, if not worse, than what happened to him, the brother in North Carolina. There's no real reason for that, and I'm sure that as the investigation goes on, we'll hear more of why that shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Without a doubt. I mean, that's just a tragic incident all the way around. Where this young man was, you know, involved in a car accident. First sought help from a woman, a white woman in her house, who then called the police because she felt that he was trying to break into her house. Police responded and ended up shooting this young brother, I believe, 10 times and killing him. Unarmed, he's seeking help from them. But you know, I think there's always been sort of recreational diversions. We've always had those. So, you know, we didn't have reality TV in the 60s, but we had, you know, comedies, Flip Wilson on TV that could, you know, divert our focus from, you know, some real hardships out there in society. What we seem to have dropped, where we seem to have dropped the ball, is we don't have the same ability to flip the switch and get serious when necessary
Exactly.
to focus on these issues. These distractions now seem to take us away permanently. And what I get, you know, frustrated by is that while we have certainly a larger black middle class, we have a black middle class that is really absent from any efforts to improve the conditions for the entire community. We have a leadership class that seems more invested in celebrity than in the hard work that it takes to change conditions. So where I think many black people in the 1960s took comfort in a Whitney Young, in a Roy Wilkins, in a Martin Luther King, because we looked at these people and we understood that they were on the job, that these were serious men and women who were serious about the issue of justice and freedom for black folks in America. I don't think we have the same comfort in our level of leadership today. And because of all the other distractions, our community isn't as engaged as it once was. So we've got a twofold problem. We've got a leadership issue, and that's leadership, whether it's civil rights organization leadership or pastoral leadership.
I agree.
Look, there was a time in these communities that the thing that protected us was strong black church leadership,
I agree.
and that included pastors and trustees and deacons, folks who sort of served as sort of the fence around the black community. We've lost that in most instances.
I agree.
And we have a generation of black pastors, many of them who are more interested in sort of building mini empires in sort of a sea of poverty than really addressing the attendant problems that are outside the walls of their church.
I agree with you 110%. I think that's a focus also of some of our theological perspective, because when your theology becomes me-centric and not centered around the community and not holistic, that's when you start to develop the things that you've just named. You see that all over the place now. And if you read scripture and really get an understanding of it, and you can start with that understanding by how the Hebrew nation was shaped. God meant for that thing to be holistic and not individualistic. Even when you read the law, and the law goes beyond the 10 Commandments, you see that it was created holistically, even talked about how you dealt with the alien and the stranger in your midst. Now, if that's not holistic, I don't know what is, but we've lost some of that sense. Even when we listen to our music, some would say, for example, that hip-hop together is the problem, but I would say the commercial hip-hop we hear is just really a mirror image of what we've become.
Oh, without a doubt. And we need to understand that it's not controlled by the artist.
Exactly.
It's still controlled by those who distribute it and those who own the rights to it and record labels that market it. And I think that, I've always reminded people, particularly those of us who are in church or were raised in church, that all you need to do is read, the Sermon on the Mount.
Exactly.
And you get a basic understanding of where we should be as a faith-based community. But we've invested so much time in our own development of theology, our own development of, church practices, that we've lost sight of the gospel. And so many churches aren't even doing the basic of what Jesus commanded us to do. And now you have pastors, I think, who are more interested in building empires. So, there's nothing wrong with being a mega church, but there's something wrong with being a mega church that has no focus on Jesus. And so, I think we're in trouble even in our churches because people are going to church for the wrong reason. They're trying to receive something in the material world that is absent from the gospel and from scriptures. And when we were engaged in the real word, our community was making great advancements because we could align ourselves with a biblical understanding of who we are as a people. We've lost that. And so now we even have clergy who are really doing more damage. I mean, I listen to some pastors sometimes because I'm always online and I'm looking on TV, and it really amazes me what I hear out of the mouths of some ministers. And so then I begin to understand why there's so much hurt in the church, why there's so much pain in the church, why sometimes young people won't go to church,
Hmm.
why sometimes, you look at the abuse of women in church,
Exactly.
and then you begin to really understand why our community is so messed up. Because if the church is messed up, what do we expect in our community?
Exactly. Exactly. And let me make a point of one of the things that you said. It's not an issue, at least for me, and I know you just said for you, of the mega church. That's not the issue because, truth be told, we've always had mega churches. Matter
That's
of
right.
fact, I was the staff pastor at one, Concord Baptist Church in Brooklyn. Many
Famous
people
one.
know that's right. And one of the main architects of what you see of that church was Dr. Gardner C. Taylor. Now, let me break down for those of you who are not familiar with that, what that looked like. The church didn't try to create its own denomination wrapped around it. It was a part of the Progressive National Baptist Convention and supports the convention. All right? The church didn't make itself an island unto itself, but out of the social worker that came out of the church working with Dr. Taylor, you had a plethora of ministries that were developed from home health care to social work to a nursing home, all kinds of things with the community at heart. And you want to know the last thing Dr. Taylor did before he retired? He created the Concord Christ Fund, where they raised over $1 million. And they took the interest from that money and they give it to community organizations every year. So now that's what you call using your wide footprint to bless others in your community to the point where they're positively impacted by
Yes.
what you do. But we don't see that as often. I'm not saying it doesn't happen because you have mega churches in all of our cities that do that. But I think, too, the other thing that we haven't said, we assume that in the past all of our churches had this holistic ministry, where the truth be told, we still have a lot of churches today that just have a mindset toward heaven. They're so heavenly minded, they're not earthly good. And
That's
that
right.
needs to change. Go right
And
ahead.
and Dr. Taylor is a perfect example because this is a man who mentored Martin Luther King Jr.
Exactly.
And the Progressive National Baptist Convention grew out of the concerns of Dr. Taylor and Dr. King and several other pastors, Wyatt T. Walker, that the National Baptist Convention was not focused on the issue of justice for African Americans, that it was only focused on this notion of, the by and by while people were suffering. And that's why the Progressive National Baptist Convention was created, because Dr. Taylor, Dr. King, those folks split and said the church has to be more holistic and involved in the lives of black people in the here and now. And folks like Gardner Taylor and Martin Luther King Jr. and Wyatt T. Walker, and the list goes on, really understood that the gospel could be applied to the everyday lives of African Americans. And
Exactly.
that's where the real power came from, because it was one thing to go to church and hear a sermon. It was another thing to live a sermon. And that's what these men did. They showed us that through our faith, we could survive in a hostile world and succeed. We've lost that. And so now our people are lost. Our young people are lost because if you grew up in church in that era, that's what you got. That's the nourishment
Exactly.
you got on Sunday morning. And during the week when you went to, youth meetings and youth services, that's the whole armor that you put on. Every day our children are defenseless against what's going on out there because our churches have dropped the ball. Because growing up, even if you weren't a member of a church, chances are you were affected by a church in your community through some program or through some relative or some family friend.
Exactly.
We've lost that community
Well,
completely.
part of there's several reasons for that. First of all, our churches have become commuter churches. Many of us, through opportunity, have moved out of the neighborhood, and our only connection is for 2 hours on Sunday morning. Other than that, we don't really connect with the people in that neighborhood. That's one issue when you start talking about church and the connectiveness. But then the other issue I think that's happening, you have churches like this that have always existed, pastors such as myself that's always been talking like this, but I think we've allowed the other theologies to clog the airwaves, and we've not used the medium of media to even come across and to talk about some of these things. You and I talked about that privately, and that pastors need to do more to utilize technology in some positive ways instead of just ways to build up themselves. And so I just think that we're at the point where the millennials and the persons in that age group are looking for relationships. They're looking for truth. People in churches are asking questions and they're wanting to do more. So I think all of these things that are happening are developing a perfect storm for us to start to impact some of these things. And to segue to our last piece, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't think we need to address this, in Randolph County, North Carolina, they decided that a classic book, Invisible Man, no longer needs to be in the library. Now, let's put this in perspective. In 1953, back in the Stone Ages, Invisible Man won the National Book Award at a time when black literature was scantily being noticed. In 1965, in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, a national poll of book critics said that this was the greatest American novel written since World War II. And the school board in Randolph County, North Carolina, decided that this book needed to be removed from the shelves. And one board member was quoted as saying, "I didn't find any literary value in this book." Talk to me about that.
Well, what that school board member was really saying is, I don't find any value in the black experience.
True.
I mean, that's what he was really saying. And when you begin to ban authors like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Ralph Ellison, what you're really doing is you're contributing to the false narrative of America. And it's just an extension of white supremacy. That there is a narrative that is truthful about our country, that is painful, that's hurtful, but in many ways it's empowering. Because as I always remind people, the story of Africans/African Americans is one of the most powerful stories in all of human history. That a people could arrive in a country with its culture stripped, his language is stripped, and still find a way to not only survive, but to flourish and succeed against all odds. So when you begin to ban the storytellers of this great history, who have challenged the conventional wisdom, who have challenged white supremacy, who have challenged racism, all you are trying to do is perpetuate the false narrative that got us in this mess in this first place. So when you start banning certain books, that's a real indication of where we are in a society. And, contrary to the thinking of this board, it doesn't just hurt black children.
Exactly.
It hurts their own children. Their children are growing up in a very diverse country and a diverse world. They're not growing up in a country where whites will dominate the discourse as they did 50 years ago. So to ban children from getting these different stories, this different narrative, is only harmful to their relations in the future. And so I think we should be adamant when we hear things about book banning. Look, we don't even do a good job of checking textbooks.
Exactly.
In the state of New Jersey, we have a law in the books, the anesthetized law, where black history is supposed to be taught in all of our public schools. Very few of them comply. Our children in New Jersey don't even know their own glorious history. If you took a survey of most black children in New Jersey, they couldn't tell you who Paul Robeson was.
And Paul Robeson is a native son of the soil
A
of New Jersey.
native son, Princeton, New Jersey. scholar athlete, Rutgers University, Columbia Law School, esteemed actor, esteemed singer. Rutgers University doesn't even acknowledge Paul Robeson in the manner that they should. So we need to really take seriously when we hear about book bannings. It's why Hitler banned books in Germany.
Exactly.
It's like when you can burn the truth, then you can perpetuate the false narrative and you can dominate a country and you can dominate people.
And I won't even get on my soapbox about Columbus discovering America because
Well,
when I was growing up, you probably saw the same textbook. Columbus is getting off of the ship, walking in the water, and there's some people scantily clad facing him as he gets off the ship. So in my mind, how did he discover something when people are already there? So, you know.
well, that's true, but that's also why, as African Americans, we also have to take the lead in making sure that the stories of others are also told.
Exactly.
You know, our Native American brothers and sisters have been so harmed in this country, and their story is one of just extreme tragedy. I mean, theirs is a true genocidal situation,
Exactly.
and we have children growing up who still believe in the sort of 1930s, 1940s, you know, serialization of American Indians as savages.
Exactly.
And until we press for a truthful narrative across the board, none of our stories will be told truthfully.
Exactly. Well, we're going to leave it here. You know I appreciate you. For our audience, let me remind you again, we have with us and have had with us Mr. Walter Fields, the executive editor and CEO of the North Star News. Thank you, my brother, so much.
Well, thank you, and I really do appreciate the opportunity. I think, you know, we need to use this new technology to stay connected as a community. So anytime you're gracious enough to invite me, I will certainly take up the invitation.
All right, and we will let the drum beat move from Memphis to Jersey and back. Thank you so much, brother. This is Black Thought, and I'm your host, Dr. Hutchinson.